be clear, any writer from any demographic group can express an idiosyncratic perspective, can say, I know this view isn't mainstream, but let's explore it. Let's see what kind of people it gives us, what kinds of values and plots and settings. But certain groups have had to deal with broad misrepresentation, right? They've had to say, here are the stereotypes that are applied to people in my social position, but here is a reality, that here is a world that is seen from behind those stereotypes, right? Um, if you take away the stereotypes, what real social and cultural conditions is this group having to contend with? This has been an issue throughout United States history, to and including the present day, but it was an acute issue in the late 19th century, as we'll see. At the moment when Paul Laurence Dunbar was writing, things were really changing for African Americans. Slavery had been over for more than 30 years, but in certain ways, things were taking a turn for the worse. Immediately after the Civil War, African Americans received citizenship. But 1 year before Dunbar wrote this poem, We Wear the Mask, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson in favor of separate but equal, embedding this idea of cultural separation within national law. So this is a situation in which expressing the perspectives of social and cultural groups that are excluded from the so-called mainstream, right? Revealing that they have ideas about this polity that are being obscured because they're not allowed to vote, for instance, or not allowed to live where they want, and not allowed to pursue professional opportunities that other people have the opportunity for. So this is the concern we see in We Wear the Mask. I'd like to give you a little bit of context for this one to show you how deeply Dunbar is participating in this debate. In our anthology, you can read the Atlanta Exposition Address, and you can also read Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, in which he criticizes Booker T. Washington. These are two very important figures from the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm sure you've heard about them and studied them in your history classes. Just as a little review, I'll remind you that Washington said at the Atlanta World Exposition of African Americans, it is at the bottom of life we must begin. Again, he's talking 30 years after slavery, and he's trying to think about how African Americans, many of them children of slaves, right? At this point, people who had been slaves would have been much older. But even the children of those people had not been able to inherit property. Slaves were freed, but they had not been allowed to pursue any kind of education or to accrue any kind of property. So they, and then often their children too, to some extent, were starting without the advantages, that the economic and educational advantages that people all around them had. So even 3 decades later, Washington says, it is at the bottom of life we must begin. Progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle. He's not saying he doesn't want African Americans to achieve progress. He does. But he says, we just have to work for it. We have to develop some economic resources. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. He's trying, in some sense, to help. It is a very controversial program, right? Because it's been 3 decades. To still say, no, you can't argue for things that might not even be considered privileges, things like better education, Um, we have to just keep struggling, and then eventually we'll make enough money, and other people will recognize and appreciate us, and then we'll get the privileges that we would want. Um, this he became, it was a very popular position among many people in Washington. Was deeply admired by many African Americans of his era, and by many white people of his era. But he was also very controversial. Du Bois famously argued that so far as Mr. Washington preaches thrift, patience, and industrial training, we must hold up his hands and strive with him. Yes, help everyone learn. Thrift and patience are fine. But so far as he apologizes for injustice, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes higher training and ambition, if anyone does this, Washington, the South, or the nation, we must oppose them. Du Bois's argument is that one can't simply keep trying to prove oneself when a whole array of social and economic forces are are arrayed against one, right? How are African Americans supposed to achieve higher learning and wealth when they can't get into good schools? When the schools they have, the teachers do everything they can, but they don't have textbooks, right? They're not funded in the same way. Um, it's fine to say, oh, yes, racism exists, but just put up with it and keep working, and eventually you'll have money and people won't belittle you anymore. But Du Bois says that's incredibly dispiriting. It it has an effect on people's motivation. So he argues that we have to fight injustice and racism now, not just try to achieve more so that it naturally withers away. Right? This was Washington's position. If we can achieve more, if we can develop wealth, then racism will eventually evaporate. Du Bois says no, we have to fight the racism in the process of pursuing these other goals. I want to argue that Dunbar is not siding with either position. He's not making an argument here. He was a great supporter of Washington's, from what I understand, although he himself had worked very closely for Frederick Douglass, who was more of a Du Boisian perspective, right? Douglass um, is famous for so many things, but one is for escaping slavery and becoming a really famous and influential abolitionist, and then later on, after the Civil War, being the ambassador to Haiti and holding government positions and arguing all the time that racial oppression and injustice should be fought directly. You don't see any discussion of that sort of conflict in Dunbar's poem. You don't even see direct reference to racism. If you didn't know anything about his background, you might not know what he's talking about. Um, Instead, he says, what does it mean to be an African American in this context where, many people say we should just tough it out and try to achieve what we can, and at that point then we'll be recognized and appreciated more broadly. And in the meantime, we just have to be strong. This is the perspective that he's sharing. And he really, even though he's not making a directly political argument, his perspective, the experience he describes, supports the argument that Du Bois would later make, right? We wear the mask that grins and lies. We make the appearance of being fine, right? We pay this debt to human guile, this canniness. Um, We don't share with the world all our tears and sighs. We let them only see the mask. Um, he's talking about a kind of performance that he doesn't say anything about this. You might not believe it. But other people say, wear the mask, pretend things are fine, just keep working, and eventually you will achieve. Um, but he says wearing this mask is painful. People want to tell the truth. They want to share what they're experiencing. So, um, to mouth with myriad subtleties, that's the fifth line there, to talk around a situation, to avoid confronting racism or injustice head on. It might be successful, but the only way to do it is with torn and bleeding heart. Because since one wants to tell the truth, it's painful to have to mouth with myriad subtleties, right? Um, he in the final stanza he appeals to Christ, right? You suffered, we suffer, we pray to thee, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We keep working, we keep singing, we keep marching and worshiping. But long the mile, and the clay is vile beneath our feet. The world, yet the world has no idea what we're suffering. Of course, with Dunbar writing this poem, the world does have something of an idea, right? This is what he achieves through writing a poem about perspectives that are excluded or occluded by writers who stereotype or disregard African Americans. And this is something that we'll talk about throughout this semester. It's something that other groups, other social and cultural groups have faced also. And so it's been an important part of national writing.